Welcome to Behind the Binary. I'm your host, Josh Stroshine. You're about to enter a new frontier of finance, one built on code, not cash. But with this new world comes a new breed of crime, where colossal financial heists are becoming frighteningly common. We're talking about single events like the Bybit hack, which saw over $1 billion vanish in an instant, the kind of theft that dwarfs traditional bank heists. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on this new Wild West of finance. Join us as we dissect how threat actors exploit the very code designed to set us free. We'll reveal some of the major players in this crime scene, including organized state-sponsored groups, and examine the devastating methods they use. All right, today's focus is on Web3 technology and what are quite incredible financial heists. This episode is really the first of its kind for the podcast because it's not a one-on-one. I'm joined by three guests today. First up is Blas Kojusner, a vulnerability engineer on the Flare team at Google. Next is Joseph Dobson, a principal analyst at Mandiant, where he leads efforts to identify and track threat actor use of cryptocurrency and other Web3 technologies. And finally, Robert Wallace, consulting leader, senior director at Mandiant, with over 20 years of experience specializing in digital forensics investigations related to cybercrime, espionage, fraud, and insider threats. So we've got a great panel lined up today to talk about Web3, decentralized finance, and the threats associated with that. So why don't we just start with introductions? And Blas, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. Basically, name's Blas. I've been here at Mandiant for just about 2.5 years now. Started as an intern with the Flare OTF team. So the specialization there is just malware reverse engineering, but we take a special interest in cases that look at malware that may be implementing 0 days. So kind of a exploring in the wild sort of situation there. Lots of real cool, interesting work. After the internship, I was able to land myself a full-time role here. And my main background comes from more traditional Web2 security, mobile security specifically. I did a lot of research with Android 0 days, got some academic papers published regarding how to use machine learning and symbolic execution in trying to identify vulnerabilities within Android, even within vendor modified versions of it, like Samsung or Huawei, etc. And as far as Web3 is concerned, I've had a longtime friend of mine who was really big into Web3, and he sort of showed me the ropes of some of the things that he did, and I always thought it was really cool. So on the side, I would look at a lot of sort of smart contract related bounties on Immunify, and then submit a couple of really low hanging fruit bugs. But it was interesting to get to know. It was fruitful. I think a lot of people have known about Bitcoin for a long time, and I am a part of that group. So it was cool to know that there is a way to tie security into that. And I think that kind of also led me to where we're at today with this panel. You know, that's kind of how I got introduced to Robert and to Joe, because for Flare on the annual CTF that we have for the Flare team, I developed a Web3 related challenge. And there was a time where there was an incident that Robert was responding to, and he needed someone to kind of help out, bounce ideas with related to Web3 stuff. And they're like, hey, we have someone who just did a little bit of Web3 things. Why don't you guys get started with the little chat? So here we are. Lots of real interesting heists that happen. And I'm kind of just excited to pick everyone's brains as well, because it's a really interesting throat that can get very, very thick. So, but that's me. That's what.
Okay, awesome. No particular order here, Joseph or Joe. Do you prefer Joseph or Joe?
Either one works. You can also call
Either
me.
one works. Okay.
Yep. Dobbs works too.
Dobbs works.
Yeah,
okay.
you know, that's one of the nice things about the kind of the crypto ecosystem is it reminds me a lot of early cyber, back when people actually used handles, and cyber was a lot more fun back then. I feel like nowadays we're all like war veterans who, you know, we're tired, we're exhausted. It's much more competitive between organizations. In crypto, it's much more collaborative, and it's still fun, you know. But yeah, so as you mentioned, I am a threat intel analyst focused on crypto and Web3, which is just a really fancy way of saying that I track bad guys across Web2 and Web3, looking at what are they doing off chain, and what kind of implications does it have on chain, and vice versa. This is my second time actually working here at Mandiant. I actually used to be a consultant, and I have a career covering intelligence and cyber for over 20 years. Although it sounds crazy to say that. And started out military, from military went into government, had a real heavy focus on counterterrorism. That was actually kind of my first exposure to cryptocurrency a bit. Was, hey, all these bad guys are using digital currency, and what are they doing, and how are they doing it, and what can we do about it? Eventually, as kind of my focus on counterterrorism wound down, began to focus more on insider threat and cybersecurity. Worked for a couple startups, and this is my second time at Mandiant. I'm a slow learner, so I was here. I worked at a startup, got burnt out, came to Mandiant once, and then I decided that I was going to go back to a startup, and 'cause I'm not that bright. Went and got burnt out again, came back to Mandiant. It's like, you know what? They treat me really well here. Okay. There's good people here. I'm going to stay here for a while.
Yeah, that's a fun evolution. It's good to go back and forth. Former military myself, and did a little bit of intel, although it wasn't anything too exciting. I was always part-time, so it was like hard getting really involved in a lot of things because it was one weekend a month. Okay, Robert. Sorry.
I was just going to say that, I was also a guardsman, right? Air guard. So it was supposed to be one weekend a month, but I really enjoyed deploying. So back in the good old global war on terror days. And so I just took every deployment I could possibly get.
Yeah. Well, I found the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, kind of like finding summers off in academia. It just didn't exist. A good year, you needed to be quite involved. So, but that's probably a topic for another podcast.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, Robert, how about you? Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here with everyone. My background is in digital forensics, a long-time incident response consultant. In the earlier days of my career, a lot of focus on accounting fraud and those types of financial investigations. And then that evolved around 2008 into bank heists. So that was, my first entry into some of the more exciting types of cases. And from there, it just sort of took off and evolved. It was, bank heists, and then espionage, and then destructive attacks and ransomware. And then, it eventually became nation states conducting bank heists and then destroying the systems on the way out the door to thwart investigations. So sort of seeing it all come together. And sort of what pulled me in the direction of Web3 were the heist. The heist in Web3 are, they're fascinating, and they're just much larger than anything that's ever happened historically. So one of the things I wanted to highlight here, and we call this out in our blog, Defied Expectations. The largest bank heist in history occurred in 2016, and that was the Bank of Bangladesh heist. And that was, I think, approximately $80 million were stolen in that heist. And that was, of course, North Korea who pulled off that case. And I worked quite a few of those cases when they were on a tear around 2018 timeframe, targeting a lot of international banks in Asia and Latin America, all around the globe. And then that became Web3 heist. And now, the high watermark for Web3 heist is now 1.5 billion. So it just dwarfs anything that we've seen historically. And it's captured my attention.
That's something that stood out. I mean, going into this episode, I was generally aware of a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but not a lot of specifics. And I have to say, these numbers were quite surprising when I started reading about them. It's just amazing what these threat actors, nation states, criminal organizations, we'll probably get into that in a little bit here, are able to pull off. So I guess we should probably set some groundwork here. I started my career early off in a lot of web technology, doing a lot of web development. I'm guessing now that was a lot of Web 2.0, maybe a little bit of Web 1. But even then, it's been so long, I've kind of forgotten these different layers and evolutions of the internet. I guess it's kind of exciting to see this Web3 as I've started to dig into it a little bit more, and the theme of decentralization. And I really like this idea of users owning their data and their content. Maybe Joe, do you want to start, or Dobbs, do you want to start by telling us a little bit about Web3 technology? What's important to understand here, in particular in relation to these financial heists that we're going to discuss?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few core tenets here that are important when it comes to cryptocurrency in general, and also you've heard Blas mention Web 2. You heard me mention. I think all of us now have mentioned Web 2 at some point, and the best description I've heard of describing what is Web 2 and what is Web 3. There's a book called Read, Write, Own. And the way the author describes it is Web 1 was read only. And so if you think back to early 90s internet, what do you have? You have static web pages that all you can do is just visit them and see what's on them. Web 2 is when there's actually interaction, right? You can input data. Now, the websites, the services are all centrally owned, centrally managed by organizations. And so the user doesn't actually own the data that they're putting in, but you're reading and writing to these services. With Web3, it's read, write, own. That means that you actually own the data that you're putting out there, right? That's the kind of the next phase, the next iteration of the internet. And the core tenets of cryptocurrency that involve this are the fact that it's decentralized, it's permissionless, and it's immutable. It's decentralized in that, unlike Web 2, there's no central entity or organization that manages everything. It's each node runner, each organization, they have their own contribution to it, but they don't control the entire ecosystem or surface. And it's permissionless. And so what that means is when there is a bank heist, right? That money, once it's gone, there's no central organization you can go to and ask, hey, I need you to get my money back, right? Because it's not managed centrally. There's no one that controls the permission, right? If you think about it, in America, if you go open a bank account, you have to provide your identification, you have to provide proof of residency, all these details. You have to get permission from the bank to open that account. You don't have that with cryptocurrency. Anyone can open as many accounts as they want, create as many wallets as they want. And lastly, it's immutable. That means that because there is no central organization, there is no authority managing permissions. Once those funds are sent, they're sent. There's no backsies, right? You can't say, no, I'm going to cancel that check and get my money back or reverse that charge. It just doesn't work like that because that's how it functions. And so really, that is the stage of, that's why these crypto heists are so wild, is because once that money is sent, right, once it leaves an exchange or leaves a DAO or a bridge, like they don't control it anymore, right? It's now under the control of another entity, and there's no central body that you can go to and say, hey, let's take that back.
So I'm actually really intrigued by that, because I think that the whole decentralized nature of it, and the whole, not having a central entity that can help you get your money back, that probably presents a lot of new challenges, right? That people have to kind of try to figure out how to deal with, and how to come to terms with the fact that maybe they absolutely lost the entirety of their 81 million crypto assets that they just had. I'm kind of curious if in your time so far, you've maybe seen a couple of approaches that were, attempted to be implemented to maybe handle that situation, right?
Yeah, it's funny because so long as you stay on chain and you never try to leave the cryptocurrency ecosystem, those principles apply. But as soon as you try to get out, right? So if you're going to take that crypto that you have, you want to convert it into fiat or local currency, you want to convert it to dollars. Now you have to go through one of those centralized entities. You have to go through someone who has the ability to convert the funds. Now it's a choke point, right? And this is part of the reason why I say that Web3 technology is built on Web 2, and that it's not near as decentralized as we all wish it would be, because there's these different choke points that control the flow of funds in and out of the ecosystem. So you'll see where North Korea or other threat actors will commit a heist, and then they'll take those funds and they try to cash them out. They might send them to an exchange, and an exchange allows them, folks to on ramp and off ramp into crypto, and they can't convert all the money they stole into dollars or other local currency, because that exchange looks at it and they say, oh, well, this is related to a hack, so we're not going to allow you to cash these funds out. And that gives law enforcement the opportunity to freeze and seize those funds. But one thing on this topic that a lot of folks don't realize is that, I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of collaboration in the crypto ecosystem. And that's because you have nonprofits, you have white hats who are going out of their way that as soon as one of these heists happen, they are tracing those funds. Blockchains are public, right? That's why Bitcoin was so revolutionary. It's not that it's a digital currency. There have been thousands of digital currencies before Bitcoin. The reason why it's so successful is because it's decentralized. There's no central entity. And so when these funds are being moved, it's all on chain. Everyone can see it. And so you have people they're tracers. They trace cryptocurrency. They trace the funds. They see them going to exchanges. They have relationships with those exchanges. They'll call them up and say, hey, you just got $50,000, $100,000, $1 million deposit from this wallet address. That's actually stolen money. Don't let them cash that out. Freeze it. We'll work with law enforcement and get a letter sent, get them to call you up and say that, yes, they're going to seize the funds. And so even though this is a decentralized, permissionless, immutable ecosystem, as soon as bad guys try to move outside that ecosystem, that gives an opportunity for the good guys to actually take action and do something.
So I guess kind of on that, I'm a little bit curious. Do you have any sort of go-to tools to be able to make this tracing process easier? And then say that the threat actor sends the funds through some sort of mixer, and then with this tracing tool, you're able to actually find what looks to be some sort of final wallet that they may be trying to pass on to some exchange or anything like that. Are there ways of tagging that wallet or adding some sort of piece of information so that way when you do report to authorities, hey, this is definitely a part of a heist, it looks like this is the final sort of point at which they're trying to extract the funds? Is there a sort of an easy way to go about that, or do you think this is still more in its infancy and it still needs a little bit of sort of fine tuning to become easier for the general public?
I think that for folks who spend enough time kind of cutting their teeth in the ecosystem, that they learn how to use and understand some of the tools that are out there. There's a lot of paid tools that are very useful for this. Of course, you have tools by Chainalysis, by TRM Labs, and others that allow tracing and make tracing much easier. But you also have some freely available tools and software, like Arkham is a website that does a great job of presenting crypto intelligence, right? Wallet attribution, flow of funds, things like that. And so you can see, you can use that for some kind of rudimentary tracing, I would say, as well as open source blockchain explorers. There's lots of them out there. So there's a huge amount of resources, but I would say it's still in its infancy. I'd be curious to get kind of Robert's opinion on this. For me, I feel like Web3 is in the late 90s phase of cyber, where it's still in its infancy. And I think that in 20 years, what we know as crypto and Web3 will look completely different than it does now, much like how cybersecurity and the internet looks completely different in the 2020s versus the late 90s. What do you think?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, but it definitely feels like it's still kind of in its infancy. I think, to Blas's question about like the tools, things of that nature, we leverage, quite a few of them, some commercial tools. We have partnerships in place. We use some open source tools. I personally just get bogged down by all these hairball graphs. They're just so messy. If you look at, the Bybit case, right? Very public, $1.5 billion heist. I think something that was really interesting And their response was they created a website called lazarusbounty.com. So they put out a bounty to the community for people to help recover or at least freeze these funds. And they offered to, give people, mostly online sleuths, a 10% cut of anything they're able to help recover. So I thought that was a really interesting approach because I think it highlights like it's not just the tools and tracking the wallets, like that's part of it, but it takes like an entire community, right? Because it's all decentralized. So you have like this decentralized approach, and right now it appears to be bounties are the preferred approach. Um, I don't know. We'll see how it shapes up and where it goes from here, but I found their response to be pretty fascinating, and some of the community response as well.
I was going to ask, do you think we're going to see more of the bounties? Do you think that it was successful enough and there was enough community participation that it'll keep happening? Because I don't think the heists are going away anytime soon. I wish they were, but I don't think they are.
I think we probably will, right? Like Blas mentioned, like some of the early research he was doing on Immunify, right? There's bounties for finding those vulnerabilities in smart contracts. Like it seems to operate on a like a bounty approach. It's all about getting results, right?
I mean, financial incentives in a financial ecosystem make sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then they have the competitions as well. I know that's a really big thing, and it's a huge source of income. I mean, there are independent security researchers who are making a huge chunk of change each quarter just based off of competitions alone. There are other dynamics at play as that ecosystem continues to grow. There are more sides with more competitions and different incentives, to also increase the quality because, I mean, there's always got to be someone to blame if a compromise does go down. And if you've had your project vetted through 3 different competitions and 2 different independent firms to look at what you got going on and you still get compromised, I mean, where do you go from there, right? And I guess we'll touch on it a little bit later. I'm gonna slightly digress, but that also brings up the question about the Web 2 versus Web 3 security thing, because it's just bringing the flashback of when we all dealt with our first incident together, right? When we had our first point of contact, we suspected it was some sort of smart contract vulnerability, and we looked at the the information provided to us, and we were a little bit more convinced it was actually something more related to the Web 2 side of things, right? The actual credentials to get into the cloud instance where they were hosting all the infrastructure. Apparently, they were compromised or something like that happened. So, just another interesting thing we can maybe touch on a little later, because that question is always being brought up, and with all these individuals and different parts of the puzzle with security, it's a thing basically.
I mean that's a major topic, right? When we talk with a lot of Web3 organizations, um, they're quite smart. The developers are sharp, very technical, um, but I'd say one of the common characteristics we come across is they're so focused on the Web3 security alone, like making sure their smart contracts have all the right logic and no math bugs and things of that nature, which is super important. But there was no one watching their back, right, where they store their keys, right? And if you look at some of these most impactful cases, um, many of them stem from the keys were stolen, right? They're not breaking cryptography. They're not even necessarily breaking the Web3 applications or the smart contracts, although that does occur quite a bit. But the most impactful ones, the keys are just getting stolen. And, I sort of feel like some of the early days in IR where we had to educate enterprise customers on the importance and the necessity of like EDR, right? Endpoint detection and response, and why it's important to monitor those endpoints. And we're having those conversations again now, but in Web3. However, the conversation is a little trickier because privacy is a huge component in Web3, right? We talk about permissionless, right? And a lot of EDR products sort of enable surveillance. And a lot of people in that space, they're just not fans of any type of surveillance, even if it does improve security. So, it's an interesting dynamic, and it crosses all the different decades of the evolution of the web. But there feels like a little bit of that that repeat, like, hey, we need to go back and protect developers, right? They're getting socially engineered through fake recruiters, fake job opportunities, things of that nature. And if the threat actors, get the right developer, they're able to pivot immediately into the cloud and conduct their heist. Um, what's fascinating about that is, if you look at, what we traditionally call the targeted attack lifecycle, right? Also kind of known as the kill chain in the industry, all the steps an attacker has to do, right? They have to gain that initial foothold, maybe escalate privileges, do internal reconnaissance, um, work their way up to domain admin, privilege escalation, and ultimately achieve their objectives. That still holds true in Web3. Um, and I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten that component of it. Like there's all these steps, methodologies that attackers take, and you just need to look at those fundamentals and figure out how to disrupt that chain along the way, so you can prevent them from getting to their objectives, which are typically, in this case, the theft of, assets. And they're pretty impactful, right?
I think one of the core things that we see in Web 2 that we don't see in Web 3 is that principle of assumed compromise, right? Where in Web 2, you actually have like threat hunting inside of networks. You have large organizations that proactively look for the compromise. There's an expectation that like they're going to get owned at some point, and so they need to plan for it. And whereas in Web 3, there's almost this like fatal view of I can never get compromised because if I do, my keys are gone and then everything is crushed forever. And so what that leads to is a very fragile organization that they try to protect against everything. And they don't have plans. They don't have an IR plan. And when it does happen, they don't know what to do. Whereas
I feel like a lot of their monitoring is right on the blockchain. So monitoring for large transactions, and to use like a sports analogy, right? That's like just playing defense at the goal line instead of like all the way up the field, right? Like don't let them get to the goal line is really one of the main objectives in security.
Yeah, because you're still talking. I mean, a compromised developer workstation that starts with a phishing email. We're still talking very traditional initial attack vectors and relatively traditional techniques here. So we can't forget about that. Organizations can't forget about that. So, Robert, is there maybe, I think some names have already come up, some of the major players here. Can you maybe shed a little light on is there a leading criminal organization or nation state behind some of these large hacks? I think the North Korea APT got mentioned already, Lazarus as a common name. And if you're interested in where that name came from, check out the podcast previous episode. The person that named that talks about that in one of the previous episodes. So yeah, can you maybe provide some insight there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of players in the space, criminals predominantly, but I would say the apex predator right now is North Korea. They're stealing the largest amounts of money. They're doing it the most often, and they're reportedly using these stolen funds for funding their, missiles and weapons of mass destruction and things of that nature. So it's it's got all these geopolitical implications as well, right? You would think like, why does this small crypto project, with 10 devs that loses 10, 50, $100 million, like why is this so fascinating? And it's because of the geopolitics around it, and they are definitely the main ones to be on the lookout for. You referenced that previous podcast, which I think is a really good insight into the history of where the name came from. And that name is thrown around so much in the industry. Everyone just says Lazarus, and they're just kind of referring to North Korea in general. But there's actually, we track it much more granular, the specific groups within their hierarchy in the organization, reporting structures, and things of that nature. And we oftentimes collaborate with U.S. law enforcement on these cases, no matter where they are in the world, because this is actually a high priority for the FBI, because they don't want these funds going to that regime and being used, the way that they're being used currently. Lazarus is the big one. I think there's also another really interesting podcast it's worth mentioning. The BBC put out a really entertaining and insightful podcast called Lazarus Heist. Came out a few years ago. And it's just a really good narrative, right? Like we're all a bunch of computer nerds talking about the guts of it. Joe's over here showing us the book.
It's also a book, which I highly recommend.
Yeah. Like this podcast, like my kids love this podcast, right? And it talks about the evolution of their cybercrime and their heist, everything from the Bank of Bangladesh on up to what they've been doing in crypto. Although it doesn't necessarily cover all the latest heists that have been happening since then. But yeah, they have a long history. I first encountered or at least my first North Korean IR was the Sony hack, if anyone remembers that from the 2014 timeframe. It was a destructive attack related to the movie, and we don't have to go into all that, but that was my first encounter with them. And they've just, continued to become more and more brazen since then.
I agree that North Korea is the apex predator in the crypto ecosystem, but I have a strong suspicion that we're going to see more threat actors, nation state and non-nation state, do heists. I think a great example of that is just from a few weeks ago with the conflict between Israel and Iran. There was actually a compromise of an Iranian crypto exchange, Nobitex, and it was done by a hacktivist organization. I'm not going to try to pronounce their actual name, but it translates to Predatory Sparrow. And they stole like $90 million and they burned the money. And so that means that they took the money and they sent it to vanity wallet addresses that no one has keys for as a message. And I think, like, to me, that's the evolution of warfare and conflict in cyber, is now you see hacktivist organizations going after funding for regimes and organizations by targeting cryptocurrency exchanges.
That actually kind of raises an interesting point now you think about it, because I remember when I was first getting a little bit more deep into this whole sort of realm of things, right, with quote unquote cyber warfare, where North Korea, instead of investing billions of dollars on planes and tanks and the whole traditional artillery, they would invest thousands of dollars on a few computers and a warehouse space to kind of get people in there and some education you can find online for free, right? So it also kind of brings an interesting point about how a small group of people who decide to want to make a statement can cause tens of millions of dollars worth of impact from a remote area or remotely, right? Rather than have to invest in some insane artillery and destroy actual physical infrastructure. That's really crazy to kind of think about how it's progressed, because it will do some real damage to lose $90 million. I mean, and that's just kind of insane to think how a nation state can cause as much impact as a group of hacktivists, right? I don't know of another time that's really been seen before when it comes to think about it.
Cyber is asymmetric, and so is crypto.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the social aspect, the social engineering aspect here of how organizations and maybe even individuals, I suppose, become vulnerable. What are some of the more prevalent attacks then? Is there can we lump these into broader categories, and maybe a little bit of the technology too, for anyone who's not interested? And I had to look up smart contract. It's been a while since I've really thought about that in any significant way. So yeah, Robert, do you have any can you maybe shed some light on that area as well, and a little bit of the underlying technology? And Blas, maybe I know you're a reverse engineer, vulnerability researcher. Can you maybe take us into some of the technical details afterwards?
Yeah. We put out a blog, and maybe we can link to it in the show notes, called DeFi Expectations, and we sort of break it down. We have sort of like what we've been describing around what I would call like these traditional Web2 attacks. I'm using air quotes here, but essentially the ones that sort of follow the targeted attack lifecycle. And then we have some of the newer, more interesting cases around smart contract hacking and exploits. And I've been working with Blas now for a few years, and I consider him our smart contract whisperer. Right. So I'll let him talk about some of the different styles of attacks that we're seeing um, related to smart contracts in particular. And I'll just say this: what's particularly interesting about a smart contract exploit is that it does not follow the attack lifecycle. Right. This is just attacking a web application until it barfs out money, and there's a lot of ways to do that. So I'll turn it over to Blas.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it does come a lot of different shapes and sizes, and it's a very different way of going about attacking a system. I mean, traditionally, from what I was used to, is you're given some executable that runs on a computer, and it's got all these sorts of capabilities to manipulate different artifacts on the system. It can establish persistence. It can inject a payload into some other sort of uh, process with higher privileges, and you can attack through many different vectors like that. Whereas with smart contracts, you're kind of just given a program that runs on chain, and you're using resources on chain, and you're kind of just paying it to perform, like, I guess, database search types of transactions. Um, they are interesting because a lot of the times projects that do get compromised also have the plain source code available in their GitHub repository. So it's also more of like a white box approach at these things, which is a really good thing, I personally think, because it can also help triage incidents a little quicker. And as far as the different types of exploits in the blog that we wrote together, we talked about something like reentrancy, which is a very common attack, flash loans, and these are all sort of more programmatic level attacks. Reentrancy is when one contract makes an external call to another contract, but say that the safety checks around this external call aren't really present. So this, the second contract that was called can make a call back to the first contract, and the state variables are just off. Something like gas reefing is also very common. I did an internal presentation on this, and it's basically when you say you make another external call again, but and then a reentrancy happens, right? The reentrancy can potentially send you billions of bytes of data if it wanted to. And there's a thing on smart contracts called gas, right? And you can run out of gas. So that just doesn't happen on a computer system. I mean, you could run out of RAM, I guess, when you're trying to run something in memory. You can exhaust system resources, but it's not going to cost you millions of dollars to actually get it to finish running. Here, you can potentially be griefed for all your money. And it's just going to be a terrible situation. So the stakes are also different. The stakes are higher when it comes to programming things with smart contracts. So you're definitely going to want to be very safe and secure about this. And I think we've been consulted by companies who want to have some sort of smart contract review individually, right? These companies, what's interesting is that they can range from actual traditional financial institutions who want to get into the space, but it could also be sometimes startup projects, right, Robert?
Yeah, and gaming institutions as well.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess with more of like NFTs or anything like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and it's cool to see that there is some translation from the sort of traditional security approach to this code versus this approach, because um, you know these people obviously want to make sure that their projects are secure. If they're going to be getting millions of dollars of funding from investors, they're going to want to make sure that the investors know that their investment is safe and secure as well. And in order to develop good smart contracts, you just got to have good security practices. And it's good to know that these practices are the same as if you were to just develop a traditional regular piece of code. I mean, when you're setting state variables, making a call to some external contract is going to be similar from one Python script making a call to some other Python script or Python library. you're going to want to verify that whatever value was returned is actually something that you were expecting or you can properly handle, right? Versus it just being treated as it's normal, right? If I ask you to give me the name of a fruit and then you just give me some random number instead of the name of a fruit, in a traditional programming sense, I'm going to want to be able to handle this type of different user input. It's no different if you're trying to validate some data that's returned from an external contract, right? You're just thinking about it in slightly different ways.
I think one thing that's really neat about smart contract exploits is when they happen, you can see them on chain. And so you can see like what was the exploit that was used. And this is something you don't traditionally get, at least not in real time, in Web 2. And so you can actually see in real time, how does this exploit work? What is the attacker doing? And there's all kinds of depth that you can go into on like front running exploits and or copycats, where there's been instances where there's been a smart contract exploit that'll drain funds, but it only drains a little bit at a time. And so then other people will see, oh wait, that's draining money, I want to drain that money too. And so now you have all these copycats that are literally copying and pasting code from the transactions, trying to drain the money as well. I don't know if you've looked at those before, Blas, but they're fascinating.
Well, I've seen some slightly or some automated approaches. There was an article that I read when I was I think I was helping out Rob with an incident where there was a suspected repeating nonce, and we were trying to read an article where this sort of exploit was found before with a more outdated chain, and it is very interesting how someone who is still unknown at the time of when they wrote the article automated a way to look at all the transactions on chain, and I think they were extracting the R value or the S value of a transaction to see if there was some repeating nonce that they could derive from it, and if it happened enough times, they can get the private key for a wallet, and they were able to steal a good bit of money. I'm not exactly sure on the amount, but all I know is that they called it the monster in the woods because it would just pop out at very specific circumstances, and they never knew who it was. And the crazy thing about it is that you don't know who it is, right? You're not going to get your money back. There's no one that you can go to. You're just doing an innocent transaction from one party to the next, and then it's just gone. And what are you going to do, right? So that was really interesting. And then I was going to tie it to something else, but it kind of escaped me right now. But yeah, you see those things, and it's really really interesting because the dynamics are different. Oh, I was going to tie it to ambulance chasing. That's kind of the other thing that can happen, right? So you have all these funds that are being drained, right, from whomever, right, from a certain party, and then someone else hops in to drain those funds, right, and they start draining funds from users. And then there's the consequence of some other person who says, you know what, let me send a message to this wallet and say, hey, if you want your funds back, you should send more funds to this other wallet. You just don't see that in traditional security, right? Somebody could be absolutely fully ransomed and compromised and wrecked, and they could be all kept under wraps and you wouldn't know because they're just doing some local intranet, right? And then you have, or intranet, not intranet. And then you have all these external things where an exploit's taking place in real time, and you can fully see the consequences unravel. And it's just crazy to know that there could be even more adding salt to the wound there than initially expected.
I suppose that counts then as any mandatory public disclosure that you've been compromised.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So years ago, when I first took my first programming job, I was at a credit card processing company, and college for me in the early 2000s was absent of any secure coding. It was just focused on computer science fundamentals and writing some software. And so when I got to this company, one day I was approached that, hey, we're dealing with some sensitive data. We should probably ensure that we're writing as secure code as possible. And so secure coding is just kind of a fascinating thing. And I'm wondering the same thing with the AI models and LLMs and all of this stuff. Where does security take its place in the developer mindset? because it's often it's different. I think it's a very different way of thinking about writing code and working with technology. So anyways, I went to, a WASP top 10 back then, and that was kind of my starting point to jump off to it. I know you've mentioned that there's a lot of overlap, but is there any like key takeaways for developers building contracts or organizations that are dealing with this technology, to just start as resources to get help, to write good code, to make sure they're doing things right?
I mean, they can honestly just look at previous compromises and previous hacks and just try to understand what to avoid. A big piece of this is just knowing how the technology works in a general sense. When you make some sort of external call, you want to make sure that you avoid a state change after this external call because of that gas griefing attack that I mentioned earlier, right? You can avoid a lot of trouble with also just not using outdated calls or unsafe calls, right? You want a big form of or some known exploits happen because the second argument of a function that is outdated is set to just some default value. Um, just use the updated function that makes it safe, and you can kind of avoid even having to think about these small things that can lead to really large consequences. And then I don't know if Robert or Dobbs, if you guys have anything else to add in a more general sense, outside of the programmatic, because I know that, like we mentioned earlier, with the social engineering, that also has something to do with it. And, I'm sure you guys can pinpoint some other spots there.
Yeah, maybe beyond the secure coding aspect is just operating from secure infrastructure. I feel like if you're developing, a smart contract, a decentralized app, a DApp, if you will, um, you know, you use like like don't use your home computer, your personal computer, which is very common in Web3. It's sort of a bring your own device type of world, which is fine, but like maybe don't have like Telegram and LinkedIn and all your social stuff, all the places where it has an increased attack surface, in the same place where you're maintaining code that has access to keys to hot wallets or things of that nature. Like, harden your environment and understand that you're operating in an adversarial space.
Hey, look, I always encourage people to use Cubes OS, okay? But I think I'm kind of the paranoid guy in the corner. Um, uh, I think for me, my advice is plan for bad things to happen, right? And so to put that in terms of like smart contracts and coding, you think about throughput limits. Is there ever going to be a situation where you want 100% of the funds of the smart contract to go to a single wallet, right? Put in fail safes, put in checks, right? If a transaction happens, it's going to do that, then maybe cause a freeze or require a special transaction from certain other wallets to unfreeze those funds. Like there's a lot of different things you could do. Require a DAO to hold a vote on whether to release those funds. And for folks who haven't heard of a DAO before, that's a decentralized autonomous organization. Think of it as kind of a decentralized club of like-minded people who have a shared interest in the future of that token, currency, or project. And so there's all these different things that could be put in place. It complicates the code a little bit, which of course introduces risk. But at the same time, a lot of these bridge hacks that we see, they allow 100% of the token to be moved in a single transaction. And why would you ever need that or want that when you have a bridge that's worth millions and millions of dollars? For folks who don't know what bridges are, that's what allows you to move funds from one blockchain to another.
That's really interesting because mentioning those safeguards that you bring up also starts kind of to remind me of some other concepts that we've seen as well about the malicious use of the blockchain as well. I kind of wanted to tie that in a little bit with that whole ether hiding thing that we've all talked about, because the individual projects want to account for any edge cases or any interesting things that can lead to exploits. Sometimes you even see it on the chains themselves. They'll have certain function calls like that whole ETH call situation where you can read data on chain for absolutely free. And that can lead to those sorts of instances where some threat actor wants to leverage Web3 technology for malicious Web2 purposes, right? And they use it as some sort of dead drop resolver to extract some small payload on chain, but because it's stored in some sort of known domain, right? Something like the Binance Smart Chain. I mean, say you're working at a company that does work with Binance, it's going to be a little bit difficult to start to block all of that sort of known traffic. Um, Always interesting seeing how it ties into Web2, right? In certain ways. I see Robert, you're nodding. It's I'm sure there's some other things to say here, right?
Okay, well, Joe, so you mentioned DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. If I have that acronym lookup correct, or if I should say, if Gemini has the acronym lookup correct, um, those seem to be related to governance attacks, and I don't think we've talked about that yet. Is that something you could also tell us a little bit more about? I know it was covered in the blog a bit.
Sure. So, whenever you have a token, there's it's governed by a smart contract, right? Whenever you have a DAO, right, oftentimes that is also governed by some sort of smart contract. And so with governance attacks, that is, there's a decision-making process that happens there, right? Where folks are voting on something and they are looking for a particular outcome. So if a crypto protocol wants to change how they're handling certain kinds of tokens or change a certain kind of functionality, maybe they want to change block size, something like that, they might have a vote for it. And the usual way it happens is the folks who own the most tokens get the largest share of votes. What that means is folks who are active voters, because oftentimes it's not who owns the most out of everyone, it's who owns the most out of the active voters. So if you have a vote and only a few folks are actually taking place and participating, then they can influence, they can have a lot of influence across a protocol, across a project. And that way, they can influence how things are handled. A great example of this, right, is malicious attackers. They can get a large number of tokens. They can buy them. They can swap for them. They can acquire them. If they get a majority out of the active voters, then they can start to vote things for themselves. I've heard it described as the bank CEO decides that he's going to award himself all the money in the bank, right? And who's going to tell him that he can't do it? He's the CEO. He'll just fire anyone who says no. And so when you own enough of the tokens, when you own enough of the protocol, when you have enough influence over the governance, you can basically award yourself those tokens. And that's kind of a governance attack. I don't know, Blas, Robert, if you have a simpler, clearer way to describe it.
I think you got it pretty accurate. And folks can check out the blog if they want to see some more information and an example of a governance attack. I think we provide the example of the attack on Tornado Cash, which is a popular mixer on the Ethereum network. So go check that out.
I would like to revisit what Blas was saying, though, about ether hiding, because I think that is one of the most interesting, fascinating examples of malware that touches both Web 2 and Web 3. Ether hiding is, you can have portions of malicious code stored on chain. Sometimes it's stored in the clear. Sometimes it's stored in an encrypted or obfuscated manner, and they're able to pull that down, and it looks innocuous because they're pulling it down from an on-chain resource. So it's not like they're going to threat actor domain1.com. No, it looks like they're looking at BNB Smart Chain. They're looking at Ethereum. They're looking at these blockchains where you can store arbitrary information, especially in smart contracts inside of storage variables. That content can be pulled down and used as part of an intrusion. And that's, to me, that's incredibly clever. I'll tell you, it's definitely happening more than folks have talked about, and I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon because it is effective. It is it's very interesting.
The old school technique for dead drop resolvers was to insert encoded malicious commands onto like Microsoft TechNet articles, like in the comments. So innocuous website, nobody's blocking that. and within there, malicious commands are being stored. And now we're seeing that next evolution where it migrates on chain.
Yeah, so a similar thing that we've seen is where some bad actors will actually, whatever the domain they're using for serving malware, they'll store that in a smart contract. And so it's good for them because, they have an easy method where they can distribute updates on where they want things. It's, again, permissionless, authenticated, all these things. So it's hard for good guys to stop it. But it's also really interesting for us because we can actually see in real time when they're updating those domains, when they're updating the smart contract. So that allows us as defenders to track it like, okay, we know they're still active because, the threat actor is still active because they're updating their domain. We can, look at that domain right away and see what they're doing. If we take action against that domain, how long does it take them to respond? What are they doing? And it creates a very fascinating Web3, Web2 cat and mouse game. When we do something in Web2, how long does it take the threat actor to respond in Web3?
And what's really interesting about that is also the resources necessary to be effective in that. I mean, it's going to cost you cents on the dollar to be able to update the state variable of some smart contract that you have to have a second stage JavaScript payload that will then point to the C2, right? And even then, I mean, for example, for the Flare-On challenge that I did it in the testnet. The testnet is just as available as the mainnet, and it's all run on fake test currencies, right? Obviously the test has its own things where it'll sometimes reset and you can probably just lose your state, etc. But you could even do something effective like that for totally free. And it's not like you can take down this on-chain smart contract that's storing the second stage payload, right? It's decentralized and you just can't do that. So it's a really, really interesting challenge, and it's going to be intriguing to see how it develops, I think.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing the evolution of cyber threats, cyber warfare, and this is why I feel like we're back in the late '90s, because like, what are all the countermeasures to these things, right? What technologies are going to be invented? Like because now we have cloud-based antivirus, we have EDR, things like that. In the '90s, we didn't have that, right? You had static antivirus signatures that you had to manually click and download. Right. If you paid a lot of money back then, at least for me when I was growing up, you might be able to get the automatic downloads. But if you're on dial-up, right, you're not going to have an automatic download. You have to click and choose. You have to run the scan independently. And so I feel like we're in the early days of Web3 security, and what are things going to look like?
I am curious to see if there might be maybe a little more to add with regards to Bybit.
That was interesting. The Bybit case is fascinating. There's a lot of public reporting about it, and Mandiant was very much involved with that case. I think one of the more fascinating takeaways from that $1.5 billion heist is that Bybit itself was not compromised, meaning their network, their developers, their machines, they were not under attack. What was fascinating about it is this was a front-end attack on the website that they use to manage their wallets. The website's known as Safe Wallet, and it's used to have multiple signers for transactions, right? So you think about it, if you have a multi-sig wallet, right, it's like having, like dual controls, or if you think of traditional finance, right, having more controls, and it requires multiple people who are geographically dispersed to authorize a transaction. But this attack on the front end, which was targeting Bybit, but by way of the front end Safe Wallet, essentially, tricked the users. What they were seeing on screen wasn't what was happening on chain. And I think it's a fascinating discussion, and probably worthy of a whole other podcast. You could sort of talk about the intricacies of it, because it's the largest heist ever, and it was truly unique in the way that North Korea was able to execute that attack.
Yeah, our North Korean friends are back.
Oh, man, they never left.
Never left.
Something I think that is worth chiming in about is that, right now crypto is seeing massive adoption, and I don't anticipate that slowing down anytime soon. But taking action against bad actors requires collaboration. And in cyber, it's actually kind of a tough sell to get people to care about crypto. A lot of folks in cyber, they look at crypto as a flash in the pan. They look at it as just, money being used by bad guys. They don't see legitimate purposes. They don't see it as relevant. And I think that that's actually really sad, because you have a really fascinating technology, whether you're looking at the math of zero knowledge proofs. You have really fascinating TTPs, whether you're looking at either hiding in blockchain as C2, or you have just the technology portion of you can move $1.5 billion for a gas fee of like less than $50. And so I think it's sad that a lot of folks in cyber just don't care enough about crypto. They view it as the casino and not as a technology that's worth more attention and worth their time. And so I hope that changes.
How do you think you could change that? Because that's been a theme most of my career. Education. We got to get more people aware of. You pick your topic in cybersecurity. That approach doesn't seem to work. And even when I can look back at, I think the Target breaches from whenever those occurred were one of the first really public breaches that caught everybody, really made national news. At least it was one of the first that I can recall. These numbers are staggering. They're as you just mentioned, Robert, the Bybit hack now has been fairly well documented. I mean, if these things aren't catching people's attention within our industry and profession, what's going to get them to care?
I don't know. I do empathize with why people sort of tune out, because maybe the crypto industry or crypto Twitter, isn't doing any favors, right? It's very noisy, number go up, very obnoxious, lots of scams. It's just like EU, right? Like, I'm not go there. I think what, at least as a security practitioner, what captured my attention, are the heist and the threat actors that are there, right? If you're interested in what's happening in security, this is an interesting space to be. I don't necessarily know how to change people's minds, because a lot of that stuff is still continuing, right? We'll just call it the obnoxious crypto scene, right? I mean, we all see it. But I think if you're, a serious security practitioner, being able to look beyond that and look at like who the threat actors are, what their motivations are, the geopolitics involved, I think that will sort of help you to see it in a new light and seek a deeper understanding of it. At the end of the day, it's just money, so you keep that in mind. But for us, right, we're very much focused on the threats.
I think that as we see more regulatory clarity, more companies will adopt cryptocurrency in various different ways, and cyber teams are going to have to learn about it. But I would hope they would do this before they have to, right? Before it's kind of almost too late. Some great examples, right, of similar topics is like North Korean IT workers. Nowadays most cyber people are aware of North Korean IT workers. But if you actually roll the clock back and you look at when the FBI first came out with their alert about North Korean IT workers, it was like 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, people were not sitting down, cybersecurity folks were not sitting down with their HR departments to go over interview questions to identify remote workers that could be working for North Korea. And in the time that it took for the industry to catch up, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars has been siphoned out of economies and sent to North Korea. And so if we can become more proactive and more agile and more engaged on understanding innovation and technology like cryptocurrency, then I think that can help to prevent a lot of malicious activity, rather than waiting for after something bad happens and then reacting to it. You got to be proactive. And I agree with Robert. I think that crypto definitely has a marketing problem.
Yeah, that will probably be fixed, hopefully through more maturity in the space, in all sense, right? Culturally, but also uh, infrastructurally speaking. So I agree with both of you. I really have nothing to add. I think you put it all really well, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're working on reverse engineering malware. It's a lot of times it's very, at least the roles that I've been in, very reactionary. We're getting samples and picking up TTPs and whatnot as they're being discovered, when and if they're being discovered. And I don't spend a lot of time. I don't get to spend a lot of time looking ahead and doing these sort of brainstorming sessions on how could this technology be abused and how could malware authors. And I think that would be a neat area to have on a security team or within a large organization, and putting out this sort of think tank stuff. And likely if I've had the idea, it's being done somewhere, so I'm just not aware of it. But that would be really neat. Okay, maybe last question here then. So we've talked a little bit of thing about current state, the prior state of web technologies and these financial heists, and the future. So what is the future? What do you think we have on the horizon for us in terms of Web3? I imagine there's got to be a Web4 lurking out there somewhere. I have no idea though, because I didn't look that up. But like, what are you excited about, anxious about, concerned about here as we're going into the rest of this year and next?
I'm going to sound like a meme here, but the what I find absolutely fascinating are the implications of AI usage with cryptocurrency. I've heard it phrased as AI agents are never going to have a credit card, but they will have crypto wallets, and I think that to me is one of the most exciting things. And seeing how that advances, there's also terrible implications there, but I'm going to put on my optimism hat. And I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating and exciting to see all of the amazing things that can be done by joining those two technologies together.
You had mentioned account creation earlier, and I made a note about the AI impact. So that was something that caught my attention too, because you said there's very little required, really nothing at all, it sounds
Yep.
like, to create these accounts. So that seemed like a very ripe area for AI and that agentic approach to for both good and bad. So okay, yeah, that does sound quite fascinating and maybe a little terrifying.
I guess from my end, I also am really looking forward to just developments in the tooling as well. As far as the secure code review practices goes, I mean, there could definitely be better ways of decompiling bytecode that's on chain. Sort of seeing what's going on there. I know there are projects to automate the way that the data is read on chain for transactions to see if maybe there are malicious payloads that are being stored on there. I am really looking forward to just seeing how the libraries progress, and how projects sort of find ways to automatically detect if some sort of external transaction is about to go to a smart contract that has already been associated with a previously known malicious campaign, or if it's going to be making a call to a smart contract that is malicious. Different ways of detecting that, and then different ways of just being able to sort of detect vulnerabilities within known code. That way, the developers are already avoiding catastrophe from ground zero. Really, really looking forward to seeing how that whole side of things progresses as well.
Yeah, is there my knowledge of programming smart contract is very limited. A quick search revealed there's some languages to do that, and that the bytecode is often what's stored. Do they come with decompilers or disassemblers to help recover that, or is that a task that you have to take on yourself?
I can't speak for the general community. Me personally, if I can't find the source code from something on GitHub, or from the project themselves, then yeah, you're gonna have to go on chain and get the source code and look at it through some, Solidity disassembler or something like that. There are different languages for different chains. I mean, there are things written in Move, there are things written in Rust, Solidity, and they all come with their own ways of sort of formally verifying if this does what you want it to do. There are different technologies for something like taint analysis on Rust-based smart contracts and seeing how far some user input can go or traverse throughout a certain precompiled program. It's all just very experimental at times. It deals with very new languages, and the space is just ever growing and ever changing. I'm sure with the influx of more security centered audiences will definitely yield interesting improvements with all that's going on in that space as well, I think.
Okay, awesome. Robert, I guess the final thoughts for you.
I think other than the two items that Joe and Blas highlighted, I think an additional one that I'm interested in is seeing the increased collaboration between sort of the Web3 online sleuths and the more, we'll say, traditional cybersecurity firms, because there's so much threat intelligence we have, and all these things are really just combined. But looking at it from a holistic perspective and not just Web 2 versus Web 3, it's really like these are threats, and this is how you deal with these specific types of threats, and here's the technology components that are part of it. I think we're in the early innings of that phase, so I'm interested to see sort of how that shapes and evolves going forward.
Okay. Well, I think that we call that an episode. So thank you all for your time and your dedication to the field and the profession and all the work that you're doing. It's amazing. It's always so humbling to hear all of the work that everybody is out there doing and accomplishing, and how little of it you get to brag about in a way. Not that we do it for the bragging, but just the amount of good that's being done that never hits the headlines. So thank you all for your time and efforts, and for joining the podcast. Hopefully we can do this again and maybe continue with this theme or something else that's exciting that happens here in the upcoming months and years.
Thanks, Josh.
Yep. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
And that's all for this episode of Behind the Binary. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It really helps us to reach new listeners. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring.